mission applicable? Is it something that follows the combatants or the terrorists wherever they may go on the armed conflict? I don't think anyone expressed that exact sort of very wide theory. But is it something that's narrowly constrained to a battlefield traditionally defined with an intense amount of fighting? Or is it a slightly wider understanding that's not so constrained by this kind of conventional understanding of a battlefield that we saw in World War II? So these are the debates that I see sort of lots of disagreements and not a lot of common ground. But thank you very much for both of your very intelligent discussions.
Thank you very much. We have just about 15 minutes, so I'm going to make an executive decision to revise the program slightly. Here's what I have in mind in the interest of generating as many questions and comments from the audience as we can. First, when you pose your question, could you please indicate to whom you are posing it? And all three of the panelists are fair game. And then what I would like our panelists to do is collect those questions and then address them in their final comments. So basically we're doing away with those concluding remarks and folding them into the answers to the questions and comments. So we have a microphone here and a microphone there, so please.
This will end with a question for Professor Lewis, but since Professor Ohlin brought up Jus ad bellum and Jus in bellum, I'm familiar with those as part of the Christian just war theory. They were first, I think, St. Ambrose was the first one to write a just war theory. And you don't, in my understanding, as a Catholic, you don't get to talk about Jus in bellum until you meet the Jus ad bellum standards. That brings up the question of, are these wars that we've been in just wars or not? Clearly, popes have said they are not. They are moral, unjust, and illegal wars that we've been participating in for at least 22 years. And so my question, though, for Professor Lewis is, you mentioned the small percentage now of collateral damage or civilians killed in more recent times. But I wonder how you would feel if it were your family being killed by drones. I think you can fool yourself with numbers, but when it comes down to your own loved ones, that feels much different.
Thank you. Another question, please, on the side.
Yeah, I mean, since time immemorial, the ability to surrender has been enshrined. I'm not a lawyer, but you can always wave the white flag. You know, I understand that's part of the UN Charter. I'm not, perhaps not, but anyways, you can always do that. And now, for the first time, how do you do that with a drone? How do you surrender to the guy on the 8,000 miles away in a computer screen who's deciding who's about to press a button? And you, the target, has no idea that you are being targeted. Now, you're driving in your vehicle, going about your thing, and you have been nailed by either the White House or in a signature strike, which hasn't been discussed tonight, this afternoon, by the drone operator themselves or their immediate commander. So how do you surrender to a drone?
Good.
Tell me.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you this evening for being here. I have a question, I guess maybe for Michael Lewis. So the Irish were trying to get rid of the British for 600 years. 800 years, okay? Whatever it is, it was a long time. And there was armed conflict there in that country. And we know that many of the Irish community in the United States, and we know that sometimes in cities like in Boston and in New York City, there was a little bit of a hotbed of radical, what might be considered radical people who were raising money for arms, and they were raising money, and they were maybe buying arms here, and would it be justified for the British if that was the case right now, would the British be justified to send drones into Boston or to New York City? So that's the question.
Good, thank you.
Yes, this is for Professor O'Connell, because Professor Lewis has already said that he's essentially okay with the drone strikes that are going on right now. Do you see the laws of war evolving in the future to legalize drone strikes? Because a lot of the time, the laws of war do change as new technologies are added to the game. I remember there was a time when the highest legal authority in Western Europe, who was the Pope, tried to ban the crossbow because very much like the drone, it minimized the risk to the person using it. So in the future, do you see this becoming legal if it's illegal now?
Thank you. Please.
Hi, I thank you both and for the whole gathering here, and thank you too for sponsoring this event. My question is, if we look at who it is who are in the leadership positions in Afghanistan and Yemen, and who has notoriously been put in positions of power that is giving us, the U.S., permission to use drones. Could you both speak on that in terms of, that is it from the ground up that the permission is being given that drones be used, and also the issue of collateral damage? From my understanding, having watched the film Unmanned, America's Drone Wars, the fact that the drones go in and do a second strike within 10 minutes, killing those that are the loved ones that come out to carry away the victims, and then they are killed. Can you speak to how that affects the numbers?
My question is directed to Mr. Lewis. You mentioned that citizenship does not play a role in the legality of drone strikes. But as far as I know, the Boston bombings were carried out by two brothers who had U.S. nationality and who had had no contact with Al-Qaeda or any extremist group for that matter. Do you think that gives another dimension to the idea of legality of drones? This sort of becomes a question of they being influenced by an extremist ideology and not exactly by the Al-Qaeda. How do you think that justifies the question of U.S. using drone strikes in countries such as Pakistan and Yemen when the perpetrators of that attack were in fact Americans? Thank you.
So we'll take one more question and go. I'm sorry, you mind? Sure, okay, we'll take two more questions.
Okay. Mr. Lewis and Mr. Ohlin are both sort of starting with a paradigm that war is a norm. And Ms. O'Connell, you're one of my heroes. For your strong stance that what we're talking about here is peace, creating peace. And that's what I think is most important, especially to the young people here in the world. And I guess I'd like you both to, I'm not sure whether this is an intellectual exercise or maybe a little bit deeper, but to try to envision the world where war is not a norm. And maybe talk to that. I guess that's the question. And I'd love to hear from Ms. O'Connell too on that.
Might be a nice subject for a future event too. So I'll ask you.
This is for both presenters. My classmate James kind of beat me to the punch, but sort of adding in like the Boston Marathon bombing. I'm from Boston, and one of the younger bomber was a high school wrestler. Like he was 17, 19 years old, just like we are. My question is, now if people say, oh, that's legalist jihad, the ability that they can, make that kind of attack without any, AQAP influence. With these kinds of attacks and like drone attacks, is there a possibility that like the paradigms and the artifices that you mentioned, Professor O'Connell, as to the United Nations Charter and how that's a violation, with the modern kind of warfare, if we see far less state versus state war, is there a possibility that those kind of rules of war, rules of just war, all that Latin stuff, may not matter within 5-10 years?
I'm going to let our speakers respond. First, I want to thank you for such concise and probing questions. Proud of my town.
No.
started with, because I want it to be very clear, as the first questioner stated, the focus that I brought to my remarks is on illegal war, on when you do not resort to this military force of drones. And I never even got into the way a lawful armed conflict should be conducted in terms of the rules in bello. Because if you're not waging war, if you're using military force unlawfully, you don't even get to the question of collateral damage. Everyone you killed has been killed unlawfully. Everyone counts. So this business of drones being more precise, it doesn't matter if it's JSOC, if it's done with the drone. If you're using military force and you don't have the legal right to do so, then everyone you killed counts, and you don't say that some people count and some people don't. Our law enforcement officials, and this is why law enforcement is the proper paradigm for dealing with these important problems, these tough problems of terrorist violence, because the police are not allowed to kill collaterally. They must restrict their resort to lethal force to preventing the taking of another human life or of violence to themselves. It is a much narrower view, and they cannot take the risk of killing innocent bystanders. And that's why it's really the better paradigm for our time. We are in a time of peace. We have been moving progressively to ending all war. I am just so shocked that after 9/11, instead of working through law enforcement as this country had successfully done before, we moved and changed our whole policy and our history and went for trying to deal with terrorism as a war-fighting problem. And frankly, it just has not worked out. 11 years and we're still attacking and attacking with drones. And we're spreading this view, and this is my answer to the Boston Marathon, that violence is the right way to deal with your societal problems. We have regularized, and we're risking regularizing and normalizing the use of this kind of major violence. We need to be setting an example of peace. We need to be setting an example of how to resolve our disputes without violence. That's the kind of shift we need to make, and the example we have to be. And really the rest of the world is there. There's shock around the world that the United States is pursuing these drone strikes. There's only one other country that really accepts this use of military force outside of armed conflict zones, and that's Israel. And even Israel, my good colleague from Israel, who was a longtime military lawyer for the IDF, even he was quoted in Al Jazeera today as saying that until there are changes made, the existing legal framework binds the United States, and they're not acting in accordance with it now. Well, now, he wants to see the law changed because he says these drone strikes are not consistent with current international law. But it's really only a few lawyers in the US and Israel and the UK who are pushing for a change in the law. But they don't agree with Professor Lewis that the law currently permits this level of killing outside of the rules in the UN Charter. In answer to the question about whether the laws of governing conduct on the battlefield have to change because of the technology, there really is no appetite for this. The view around the world is so critical of the U.S.'s drone attacks, and the conclusion about what the U.S. has gained, hatred of Pakistan, lack of cooperation throughout the Islamic world because of the way we treat people in those countries, because of the differential we put between our own citizens and the citizens of other countries. This is not the appropriate way, and there's not going to be a relaxing or a changing of the rules in order to accommodate this U.S. practice and legalize it after the fact. If the lines are blurring, and I'm not sure that that's factually true, there have been plenty of international armed conflicts. The U.S. invasion of Iraq was an international armed conflict. The U.S. use of force in Afghanistan until December 2001 was an international armed conflict, so I'm not sure that that's factually correct. But the way we should be moving as a humanity is toward ever less use of that much violence. We should be using our technology so that we can limit how much violence even our police use. The great concern about the UN rapporteurs, and now we've had 4 separate reports, all criticizing U.S. drone use, is that this should never become normalized. We should not become inured, desensitized to this level of killing. We have ways, if we would use these same resources that we have put into using military force in a country like Yemen, if we had helped rebuild their police structure, their criminal justice system, if we had helped build political parties so that they could have elections and could have the kind of society that can build jobs so that young people aren't lured into these kinds of terrorist organizations. And believe me, in Yemen, the level of violence that's going on there now is traced by experts to the U.S.'s use of drones there. This has been counterproductive, and so many experts have told us that. Where we need to go, and what this technology being so pervasive means, is that we have to build the norm against that level of violence, against war, and use technology for the good of all humanity, a peaceful world, a prosperous world, a world that has high respect for human dignity.
Since we are technically out of time, I'm going to do something with Professor Logeval's permission that they do in those high-stakes international negotiations where they agree to stop at a certain time. I'm going to push the hand of the clock back just long enough for Professor Lewis to address the questions that were posed to him.
I will try to get through them quickly. I think that the civil war going on in Yemen happened before the U.S. drone strikes increased in number. Right? That there were a handful, and I'm talking single digits, drone strikes in Yemen before the civil war in Yemen got going, before the government was kicked out, before the instability was happening. So to claim that the violence in Yemen is a result of U.S. drone strikes is hard to square with the facts on the ground there. Asked about my own family killed by drones. Of course, any civilian casualty, any death anywhere is a tragedy. But let's be very clear about what is going on in places like the Fatah regions of Pakistan. And read Christine Fair of Georgetown. And she has taken on a number of the studies that have been done recently talking about the effects of drones in Pakistan. And someone who has studied that area very intently says, you don't get all that's happening there. There may not be an official civil war going on between the Taliban and the Pakistani army, but there have been ongoing conflicts there. The vast majority of bombs dropped, the vast majority of explosives going off in the Fatah regions have been fired by the Pakistani army and the Pakistani Air Force, not by U.S. drones. We're talking about hundreds of drone attacks over the last 9 years. You're talking about thousands of Pakistani Air Force attacks in just the last couple of years. Right? Very different order of magnitude, and yet there's an assumption that every person that dies in Pakistan as a result of an armed conflict or a drone or a bomb is the responsibility of the United States. That's just not factually true. How do you surrender to a drone? You don't. You don't surrender to a drone just like you don't surrender to an artillery shell. You don't surrender to a bomber. You don't surrender to a manned aircraft or a helicopter, all of which are capable of killing you during wartime. You can't surrender to everything that might possibly put you at risk. However, you can surrender to an enemy anytime you want to. You're driving along in your car and you were struck by a drone. Yes. Could you have surrendered the moment before that? Probably not. You didn't see it coming. You didn't know you were about to be targeted in that moment, clearly. But that didn't prevent you, rather than building bombs, rather than placing IEDs, rather than blowing up police stations and shooting at the British ambassador or attacking the U.S. Embassy, rather than engaging in those behaviors or encouraging and leading and directing others to be engaged in those behaviors. If you've been doing other things, then you wouldn't have been targeted in the first place. And if you decide, I shouldn't have been doing those things, and now I'm at risk because people are getting blown up for doing those things, you can walk into a police station, if they have police stations in Yemen at any time, and surrender, right? And this goes to the next point, right? Do they have police stations in Yemen? Of course they do, somewhat. But the ability of law enforcement to prevent these kinds